Hello again. I've reached the end of the rainbow. Today I'm doing my seventh of these rainbow shelves videos where I talk about a different coloured book on my shelf to get that zigzag effect. Okay, hope you're all well. Um, this is MAA Luchia, E.F. Benson. There's six books in all, but this is the one. This is the one where the two irritable ladies end up floating away on a table upside down. I first knew about MAA Luchia through the diaries and letters of people like Evelyn Waugh and Nancy Mitford and Noel Coward, all of whom were addicted to the adventures of these two ladies in Tilling, isn't it? It's Rye in real life. And I can hear Jeremy coming up the stairs with a cup of tea. He's going to slide into the room. Um, and I didn't read the books for, thank you, Jeremy. He's like one of the servants in MAA Luchia today. Didn't read the books for many, many years. I saw the TV show from the 80s, which was fab, and eventually bought the books, but the print was so small. I know this is a recurrent theme, the size of print in these videos. The books are absolutely hilarious. They're from the 20s or 30s, 31. And this edition's quite nice, but I think they only did the first one. And you can see uh, it's been bent out of all shape by being reread. The print is still tiny. Anyway, these two snobby ladies at each other's throats with this veneer of civility and all the running around that all these kind of crazy characters do in this little town. Hardly anybody has to make a living, except they do from each other when they rent out each other's houses to each other. Um, it's a cutthroat world in MAA Luchia. I want to reread them now. This is the beginning of another series that I've really loved collecting. All my copies are really battered and well read. Upstairs Downstairs was a TV show in the mid 70s that was successful everywhere. It still holds up, it's brilliant, it's mostly studio bound, it's full of fantastic actors and writing. And although I love Downton Abbey absolutely rips it off. And the thing about Upstairs Downstairs was it had this tremendous commitment to telling us that the lives of servants were essentially terrible, and the people who kept them weren't benevolent aristocrats. They were they were wicked. Um, and you know, Downton tells the opposite story. Our more modern take on the same story is look at these wonderful people, these patriarchal families looking after poor people. Upstairs Downstairs was very uh, left wing and furious still about the lives our grandparents, our great grandparents led in poverty, having to eke out a living, looking after these spoiled bastards, basically. But the books and the TV show in Upstairs Downstairs made you feel for both sides. What a hapless lot of inbred losers the posh people were in this family. And that's how the story ends up, doesn't it? With James, the oldest son in the family, um, ruining it all right at the end. This is the very first novelization dealing with the events of the first season. I think what happens is I've left my collection over there again. I will do a whole thing on Upstairs Downstairs at some point. They novelize each season, and there were five of them. It was John Hawksworth and Molly. Uh, oh, I forget her name, but she also did Juliet Bravo and various other novelizations. A novel per season, and then they did stories from the point of view of individual characters. The backstory of Rose, the parlour maid, the backstory of Mrs. Hudson, the cook, and Lord Bellamy, his whole life story. So they would reach back into the past of the show and then weave their way through to the end of the show. Very clever way of doing novelizations. Very kind of character centered. So everybody appeared in each other's books, but there was a guiding consciousness for each one. I can't believe that other shows haven't done the same thing. Doctor Who, because it began as a series of books for kids, was quite literal. You know, each serial had its own novelization, and yet when it began, they followed Ian Chesterton's line through that first Dalek story. I can't believe you didn't have novels that followed the companions and their whole backstories and novelized all their stories together that they appeared in. It's still the way I would do it, I think. If I was in charge of Doctor Who books, these kind of, there'd be a whole novel about Donna, say, or Romana telling their tale from the beginning. They do that with the Cagney and Lacey novelization, actually. I've got that somewhere, and there was only one book for Cagney and Lacey, and it was fantastic because it deals with the lives of both characters and how they come together halfway through their lives. So the backstory of Mary Beth is very Ed McBain, very 54th Street precinct, if that's the right street, the right precinct from Ed McBain. Very New York. And meanwhile, Cagney's life is very, she's a photographer in London in the glamour world. She goes to Paris. It's kind of more like a Barbara Taylor Bradford or the writer I'm thinking of, Judith Krantz almost. She's a kind of bonkbuster person. Whereas Tyne Daly is very much hard-boiled procedural detective stories. But they meet, and then halfway through the book, the TV show begins, and Cagney and Lacey are born. A very clever thing to do, and it requires the reader having that kind of recognizing the, I'm going to use the awful word tropes, but recognizing the characteristics of those kinds of genres. And the strength of a show like Cagney and Lacey, which I've always been a fan of, is that it combines two very different characters in a recognizable world. Anyway, next, here's another crime book, The Cluttered Corpse by Mary Jane Maffini. Now, this is when I was really into Cosy Mysteries, about 2007 and 2008. And I became aware of them here in import. And some bookshops would have them. They'd have the Donald Bain Murder, She Wrote books or the Jane Austen Investigates series. And my mind was blown when I saw that these existed. Because it's what I was kind of writing at that point. I was writing the Brenda and Effie mysteries. And, amateur sleuths, very specifically drawn locality, touch of the supernatural, not particularly good at investigating crimes. Everything goes wrong for them. The amateurishness of the sleuth is important to cozies, I think. Now, of course, they're everywhere. I've been told for 20 years, cozy mysteries aren't the thing. Cozy fantasies aren't the thing, certainly not. And of course now, they're everywhere too. And yeah, I was ahead of that curve. Anyway, I became obsessed with mysteries of a particular kind, and I love the ones published by Barclay, Crime, Penguin in the States. And when I went to New York, I saw the building where all this happens, and I saw the bookshops where they were crammed with mysteries. There was a mystery bookstore in Greenwich Village that I don't think is there anymore. And I bought armloads while I was there. On import, at that point, they used to be like £4 each until they suddenly all went up in price. This is somebody who's a declutterer of houses who investigates crimes, which is perfectly logical, isn't it? They're always themed, these. They're kind of, bakers who solve crimes, or people who deliver takeaways solving crimes, or people who make teddy bears solving crimes. And sometimes it gets a bit ludicrous. Lots of bookshoppy ones as well. But somebody who declutters houses is always going to be finding clues, aren't they? After freeing herself of some useless clutter, namely a cheating fiance, Manhattan financial analyst Charlotte Adams went home to Woodbridge, New York, and of course, going back to the small town is a massive trope. To start over as a professional organizer, but she's learning that foul play can creep into the most well-ordered life. Irresistible. And I love the painted covers as well. They seem to belong to a different time. In this country, we don't really have books in the same way. They try and tart them up and make them look classy, which is always a mistake. Right, this came from a church sale in Whitby years ago now. It cost a fair bit. No, it didn't. It didn't. I think it did feel it at the time. It was £4.50. The Land of Fair Delight. 3 Victorian Tales of the Imagination. Now, I wasn't so bothered about Mopsa the Fairy by Jean Ingelow or At the Back of the North Wind by George MacDonald, a book that I never really got on with. But The Little Panjandrum's Dodo by G.A. Farrow is an absolute lost classic. This is introduced by Noel Streatfeild, and it's a real find. Now, the Farrow novel was published under a different title as well, and I can't think what that was. But it's a story about monsters in an Edwardian setting in London, creatures coming to life, and the dodo is central to this. Just look at those drawings. And it's just like Edith Nesbit. It's about antediluvian animals. And I think that came into the title, actually, when they re-released it, or maybe the first title. But it's an explanation for the dinosaurs in, what's the park called? It's gone out of my head. Crystal Palace Park. When the Great Exhibition in 1851 was on, they put these dinosaurs in the park, and I went to see them with friends in 2012 and couldn't believe them. They were just like they had been in the Usborne Book of Monsters, where there was photos of these exhibition monsters. They're still there, peeping out of the undergrowth on the islands. And this book tells us, The Little Panjandrum's Dodo tells us why and how they got there. Chapters like The Skipper of the Argonaut, The Archaeopteryx, The Little Panjandrum's Balloon, The Prehistoric Doctor, A Night in the Train, At the Crystal Palace, A Difficulty with the Roundabout. It's just magic. And I'd forgotten about this. I'd forgotten how good it was. And of course, at the end, all the monsters, all the dinosaurs freeze into place and become exhibits at the Crystal Palace. That's how I remember it. I think that's how it finished. Yes. Chapter 22, Turn to Stone. Of course, Edith Nesbit did write about stone dinosaurs, didn't she, in The Enchanted Castle, which was dramatised in 1979 on the BBC, and about a park at night, and the stone dinosaurs would come to life and move very slowly through the dark, and all the Greek and Roman statues, all the gods, came to life, very pale in the moonlight, and moved around the park when nobody was there. Now, there used to be a park, there still is a park, in County Durham, near Sedgefield, called Hardwick Hall. And we were there at the hall for afternoon tea 2 weeks ago. And the park is there, but it's all very fancy now. It's all nice trails to walk around. It's very cleaned up. In the 70s, it was abandoned. And that was when I first read The Enchanted Castle and watched it on TV. And I imagined that the gods and monsters were walking around at night. I don't think there ever were dinosaurs in there. I think it was all imagination. It was just a very overgrown park. But there were fake ruins of medieval castles in that kind of Victorian folly way, and pagodas by the lake. Very, very nice park. But I must reread this. The dodo departs. The people at Suffolk House, including Perkins, maintain a most mysterious silence on the subject, and will afford me no information whatsoever, and the only consolation which I can find in my endeavours to ascertain whether these things really happened or not is the fact that on the island of the lake at Crystal Palace, all the curious animals which the ambassador is said to have turned into stone are really there. You may see them for yourself, and I hope when next you go to Sydenham you will hunt them up. And if so, you will notice what struck me as being a very conclusive proof of the truth of the narrative is that the Paleotherium's tail really looks as if it were broken off about 4 or 5 inches from the end, and decidedly as though he might have worn a false one while he was alive. There's talk of people being flabbergasted on the page before. Any book that uses the term flabbergasted. Look at the dodo. Yep, there should be a campaign to get this book back in print. I'm going to reread it at once. I'm running out of time. Last year, when Paul O'Grady died, I sat down and read the first 3 volumes of his memoirs. I'd read the first one when it came out at my mother's knee. For some reason, I hadn't read. No, I did read the second one as well. Actually, The Devil Rides Out, about his time living in squats in London and in Yorkshire, and becoming a drag queen and putting on these shows. A very kind of hand to mouth existence in some very tawdry places, and they are hilarious books. Very, very touching. He's very, very clever and scabrous and political. The first book about Liverpool in the 50s and 60s is kind of heartbreaking. There's a scene where the old blues man, Long John Baldry, takes him to bed in his hotel, and it's his big coming out is astonishingly tender. There's also, in those early books, I think all in the first book, he meets 3 iconic blondes. You can see them going into the forming of Lily Savage. Weirdly, he meets Dinah Dawes, who's completely drunk and bloated and at the mercy of all these terrible men that her husband knocks around with. And he talks to her all night during a lock-in. And then in the theatre at Lytham St Anne's, he meets Marlena Dietrich towards the end of her life. No, to the end of her performing life, when she's doing this tour, singing the old standards, dressed in pink and corseted up to the hilt. And she says, "What are you doing here looking at an old dame like me? Why aren't you out with all the gay boys in Liverpool?" He thinks, well, she's got a point. And he also, when he's working as a social worker, has to go and deal with a prisoner. And it's Myra Hindley. And he looks into these terrible eyes and sees her, this kind of iconic monster. And they're 3 very interesting encounters. And you can see him forming his own iconhood through his encounters with everybody that he meets. He remembers everything. That's what's amazing as well. That's why there's 4 volumes of memoirs. His memory for people and places is astonishing. And it's a huge generosity. Another thing that I would say about memoirs, and I've said before that I prefer the memoirs where people tell stories against themselves, where they have a bit of humility and are a bit self-deprecating and can take the piss out of themselves. I hate the ones that are self-vaunting. I'm looking at Miriam Margolyes again up there, and people making themselves out to be the wounded hero of their own tale. Paul O'Grady is massively generous and he's looking at other people. He's more interested in their stories than his own. His own story is a kind of uh, a way of seeing these other people. And especially when he's looking after kids in care and doing the social worker stuff, and when he's going to all these dreary or fabulous gay bars all over the country, it's the stories of the people around the place, in these places, and the people that he lives with in squats and stuff. That's amazing. Anyway, I would really recommend his books. I've kept the last one uh, aside. I haven't read it yet because that would be the end of it. And somebody asked this recently: do you hold books back? And yes, I do. I do. So you don't get to the end, which is daft. You should finish the whole lot. I will. Julie and Julia is a really wonderful book. Julie Powell, who I believe died recently, in recent times. It's the story of the writing of her blog where she sets out to cook all the recipes in Julia Child's Art of French Cooking in the early 2000s. And it made a wonderful Nora Ephron movie, which led me onto this book and to all of Julia Child's books. This is the classic book that comes out of a blog, a bit like Neil Perryman's Doctor Who book, where again they set themselves a challenge, or Tolstoy in The Purple Chair. There's three where they set themselves a challenge to do this particular project in a year and post about it online. They all happen in the early 2000s. And what you get from it is this shaft of light that goes right through the lives of the people who are doing it. Why are they doing this? Why are they having this mad challenge? Why are they doing this adventure? And the book that comes out of it all tells the story of that. And this is a very touching book, I think. And it's about food and love and sticking with it, sticking with things that you've said you'll do. This I reread last year. The Princess Bride I read years ago because I love the film so much and know it off by heart. The book is something else again. William Goldman has wrapped it around in layers and layers of prefaces, prologues, and palaver. It's all a great shaggy dog story. He has a very soft romantic story at the heart and a love of fantasy and nonsense. But he tells the story of the telling of it, of the selling of the film, of the making of the film, of the legacy of the film, until it gets bigger and bigger. It's like a pearl accreting layers over the years. I got this copy, this lovely hardback, for a fiver. On my first book trip during lockdown, when we could move slightly in the summer of 2000, we went to Sedbergh in Yorkshire, in West Yorkshire, which is a kind of a bookish town with a number of bookshops, and it pissed down. The heavens opened, and you had to wear masks, and all the shops had glass perspex everywhere. And so you couldn't see anything. You were just fogged up going around this large second-hand bookshop, barely able to see anything, but I did find absolute treasure. Speaking of lockdown and stuff, Breathtaking, which has recently been adapted for TV, I believe, Rachel Clark, and it tells the story of, it's here because it's blue, tells the story of the pandemic from the inside, from the point of view of a doctor who had worked in a hospice, who goes to work on the front line. And it tells the story of the first 4 months of the pandemic, and it just makes you livid, the whole thing. She tracks what the government's saying, what the idiot Prime Minister is saying the whole time, and it just makes you furious, especially now to know in retrospect that the absolute fuckers were having parties behind the scenes at Downing Street while all this was going on. It's a very beautiful book, I think, as well, though. And there will be lots more coming out about this time, I should think. I don't know if she's followed this up talking about later stages of the pandemic. I hope so. And I'd like to see the TV show as well. This came with a box of stories, the subscription thing that I did for a number of months. I saw the adverts on Facebook and became very determined to do it because of the rhetoric of saving books from being pulped. The figures that Box of Stories gave about how many books are pulped each year in Britain unread it is astonishing. And publishing is broken. They can't do it right. Publishers are too bothered about giving money to stupid celebrities for their terrible ghostwritten or cobbled together books, and not investing in writers. And I could go on about this for hours. Anyway, Box of Stories was quite good. The first box I got was full of nice things, and this was the best, I think. I did that for a few months, and it was interesting. But actually, I prefer to choose my own books. I don't want random packages. Anyway, I'm over time. That's my blue books, a selection of blue books from my shelves. I'm looking around and I can see all sorts of other things I should have talked about as well. Lev Grossman's Silver Arrow, for example, or looking for Enid, Duncan MacLean's book about his lifelong love of Enid Blyton and his search for her legacy and influence. A nice copy of Hans Christian Andersen's Fairy Tales from the 70s, really nicely illustrated. I've got so many copies of Hans Christian Andersen, I can't tell you. But yes, there's lots of blue books, more blue books than any others, I think. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed my rainbow selection over the last few videos. And press like and leave comments. I love the comments. And go and subscribe to my Patreon. And I'll see you again soon in the next episode.